Alright guys, welcome back, and in this video I want to show you how to create a really simple HTTP server. So remember that Node.js, it's a little bit different than plain vanilla JavaScript because plain JavaScript was made for the web browser. So if you're just on a desktop or a laptop chilling in your living room, you could run some JavaScript and that's all good. But the code that we write in these next couple tutorials, this is code that's going to be on a server. So in other words, whenever you create a website, people are going to try to connect to that server, wherever it is, make a request for, let's say, like some like a web file or web page or some info from your database, whatever, and your server is going to be responsible for looking at the request and sending them back some information or some files, whatever. So that's actually how you can picture it. Actually, let me go ahead and right click and make a new file, maybe a little bit easier to understand. Server.js. So this is, let me clean this up, and actually we don't even need this app.js. We'll just run everything in this server.js file. So yeah, I know whenever I'm making these tutorials I'm on a Windows machine just sitting in my room. However, think of it like this: the code that I write in IntelliJ in these next couple tutorials, this is code that's going to be on the server, and whenever I'm using the browser, just think of me of like some user who's trying to connect to your server, like, I don't know, like over in California or wherever. So again, this is code that's going to be on the server, and when I hop over to the browser, I'm just some user trying to connect to your website. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, if you think, alright, making a server sounds really hard, we probably need to download some like operating systems like Apache. I heard of that before. I probably need to stick that in there somewhere. Well, it is actually incredibly easy, and that's one of the things I really love about Node.js. So one of the things that we need is the HTTP module that's already built in. So require HTTP, and I'm just going to store it in a variable called HTTP, and check this out. The only thing that you need to do to pretty much turn your Node.js code and pretty much create a server is this: your HTTP object, call a method called createServer. Now the parameter of this takes one thing, and that's a request listener. Essentially, this is going to be your callback, or what code do you want to run whenever a user tries to connect to your server. And of course, this function that we write in here, it's going to be something like send them back a web file or a web page or some info from our database, whatever. So we didn't code this yet, but I'm just going to call it like on request. And also, another thing I want to point out is whenever they connect to your server has to be listening for a request. So I'm just going to say listen, and inside here, how the heck did that pop up? Inside here you just put the port number, and I'm just going to put 8888. Now another thing I want to do real quick is whenever we start this program, I just want to log something out in the terminal just so we have a little indicator that, alright, the server is now running. So I'll put console.log, and I'll just put like server is now running. Alright, so what we did already is we created a server, and whenever we start this program, it's going to be listening for traffic or listening for users to request through this port, and it's going to just log something out on the command line. So whenever a user tries to connect to our server, what we want to do is we want to call this function on request. So since it's going to be looking for a function called on request, we of course have to build one. Now whenever it calls this function, this callback function, it's going to pass in two parameters, two pieces of information. The first one is the request object, and this object is pretty much just information about the user's request. In other words, you can learn things like what information were they trying to get, what web page were they trying to connect to, all that stuff. Any information about the user's request we can access through there. Now the other object we need is response. So our response is the object that we can send back to them. So if they're like looking for a web file, we can send it back through the response. We can also send like status information, like okay, the connection was good, or we couldn't find what you were looking for. Here is a nice old error for you, whatever. So again, the request is from them. The response is what we're sending back. And hopefully, it's like a web file or something like that. So the first thing I actually want to do is this. I just want to print something out so we can visually see what's going on. So whenever a user makes a request, I'm just going to log out a user made a request. Pretty creative, I know. And actually, let me show you guys something cool. And this is actually something that confuses a lot of people. And I'm not going to explain what it is right now, but whenever I run this, there's a little weird thing that you might not expect. Something happens twice, and you may think it only should happen once. I'll explain what's going on in a second. But whenever a user makes a request, the first thing I'm going to do is print something out in our terminal, just so we can visually see what's going on. And then I'm going to start building my response, what I'm going to send back to them. So for the response, the first thing I want to do is write head right there. Alright, so before I hit enter, check this out. This takes a couple different parameters, a status code. Now whenever you are sending something back to the user, there are already a bunch of status codes that you may already be familiar with. 200 is pretty much the status code that says, hey, everything went okay, you requested something, I'm sending it back, no problems. You probably already know of 404 as well. This means that whatever you requested, I couldn't find what you were looking for. Something probably didn't go according to plan. And there are a couple other ones as well, and we'll talk about those later on. The next piece of information is just header information, and it says what type of data are you sending back to them. And for now, I'll just send like a simple plain text. And these can also be like files, but for right now, what you do is you call context, type in capital letters, and then since this is an object, you need a value. So text plain, and that with a semicolon. Alright, so what we're saying right here is we're going to send you back a response. Everything is going good so far, and the type of data that I'm sending back is just plain data, just like a string. So now you actually have to write some string or some data. So response write pretty much allows you to write your response, and I'll just say like here is your response, whatever, or here is some data. I'll just say that. Alright, and now the last thing you need to do is you need to call response dot end, and this just signifies that the response is ending and it actually sends it off. So let's go ahead and run this and check out what's happening. So server is now running, and actually before I do that, let me stop it. So this program isn't running yet because I just stopped it, and check it out. So obviously whenever a user wants to connect to it, this would eventually be some web address, but for right now we're just running it on localhost, which is the address of whatever program, your server, and port 888. And remember in like the first tutorial we set everything up. So if we just try to connect to it right now, try to refresh it, it says this web page is not available. It's saying that because remember, this is pretty much our server, and our server is not running yet because even though I just ran it, I stopped it. So we pretty much have no server or no program running right here. So check this out. Whenever I run it, it says server is now running, and this program is now listening for users to connect. So now look what happens when someone connects with it. It prints out here is some data. Why did that happen? Well, check it out. So it was pretty much listening for a user to connect, and whenever they connected, it just logged out a user made a request, and then it printed the URL of pretty much what web page they were trying to access. So it says, okay, user made a request, and the user made a request favicon. You see, I only refreshed the page once, or tried to connect to it once, so why did it make 2 requests? And this is the thing I wanted to point out, and it tricks a lot of people up. Whenever a user connects to your computer, or excuse me, whenever a user from wherever they are, they try to connect to your server, what your browser does is it first sends a request for whatever page they were looking for, in this case just the home page, and it also makes another request behind the scenes for the favicon. In other words, this little icon right here, you see the New Boston is like a little red square with an arrow, and GitHub is like a little black cat or whatever. So a lot of people, whenever they're first starting out, they're like, why is, it's sending like a double request every time? That's why. So, I just thought I'd explain it. So again, moving on, whenever we get a request from a user, what we say is, okay, hop over to this code and pretty much run this chunk of code, this callback method right here. So first I'm going to log something out, and then I'm going to set up my response. Says, okay, everything's running good so far. I'm going to send you back some plain text, and then we just send them back the text or whatever information they were looking for. So that is why we got this little bit of code. And again, I'm going to refresh this, or actually let me just hit enter and go there again. So now that would signify another user trying to connect, and look at what happens. We now get another request from another user. So again, there you go, and eventually we're going to be sending back files instead of just little stupid strings of data. But now that you understand the basics of it, yeah, that's that. So thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.